In November of 1985, a deer hunter walking through a stretch of forest near Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire, stopped to look at something that should not have been there. It was a 55-gallon steel drum. It sat, partially rusted, at the base of a tree in a clearing too remote to be reached by road. It had been there, by its appearance, for years. The hunter opened it. Inside were the bodies of a woman and a young girl. They had been there for most of a decade. 15 years later, in the spring of 2000, a state police investigator returning to the original site, going through a routine review of the original case, found a second drum 90 meters from the first. Inside the second drum were the bodies of 2 more young girls. 4 bodies in 2 barrels, hidden in one clearing, for periods ranging from 19 years at the earliest to 35 at the latest. It would take the state of New Hampshire another 4 decades to name all 4 of them. This is the case known as the Bear Brook murders. It is the story of a serial killer who called himself, among many other names, Bob Evans, and of 4 victims, the last of whom was not identified until September of 2025 because she was his own daughter. The woman's name was Marlies Honeychurch. She'd been about 38 years old at the time of her death, which investigators, working backward from the condition of the remains, estimated to have occurred in late 1978 or early 1979. She had 2 daughters at the time of her death. Both of them had been in the barrel with her. Marie Vaughn, about 9 years old, was Marlies's older daughter from her first marriage. Sarah McWaters, about 2 years old, was the younger from her second. When the second barrel was found in 2000, it contained 2 more young girls. One of them, approximately 3 years old, would eventually turn out to be the biological daughter of the killer himself, a child whose existence nobody outside of the killer's immediate movements had known about. The other girl, whom the investigators would initially struggle to place anywhere in any genealogical record, remains at the center of one of the most complicated cold case identification efforts in American forensic history. 3 of the 4 victims were identified in 2019. The 4th, Rasmussen, the killer's own daughter, was identified in September of 2025. The man who had placed all 4 of them into the barrels had been dead by the time the final identification was announced for 15 years. He had gone by many names. In California, in 2002, he had been convicted of the murder of a woman named Yoon Sun-jun, his wife at the time, whose body had been found buried in the basement of a house they had shared. He had served that conviction under the name Curtis Kimball. He had earlier in his life lived under the names Gordon Jensen and Bob Evans and several others. His pattern had been to find a woman with young children, to attach himself to the family, to isolate them from their relatives, to move them, and then, after some indeterminate interval, to disappear. The women and the children never reappeared. His actual name, as eventually determined by genetic analysis of his son from a first marriage, a son who had grown up not knowing what his father had done, was Terry Peter Rasmussen. He had been born in 1943. He had died in a California prison of natural causes in 2010. He was 67 years old at the time of his death. He left a trail of false identities behind him that would take the combined efforts of several states, several genealogical research organizations, and the DNA Doe Project more than a decade to untangle. In November of 1978, a 38-year-old woman named Marlies Honeychurch, living in Southern California, introduced her family to a new friend. She told them she had met a man who was going to be a good father to her 2 daughters. The family met him. The family did not, afterward, see Marlies again. They did not see Marie. They did not see Sarah. The three of them, by every reconstructive analysis that has been attempted, were killed by Rasmussen shortly after he had isolated them from Marlies' family. Their bodies were transported across the country. They were placed in a steel drum near a stretch of forest in New Hampshire. The drum was abandoned in the woods. Rasmussen continued, under different names in different states, the same pattern with other women. In November of 1985, when the deer hunter opened the first drum, he found only Marlies and Marie. Sarah, the 2-year-old, was not in that drum. Sarah was in the second drum, the one that would not be opened until 2000. So was the third girl, the one with no trace in any database, the one whose identity investigators would spend 25 years trying to name. Terry Rasmussen was identified by investigators in 2017. The identification came through a genealogical analysis performed by Barbara Ray Venter, who would later become known for her role in identifying the Golden State Killer. Ray Venter worked from a Y-Chromosome profile, the male lineage DNA, that Rasmussen's adult son from an earlier marriage had uploaded to a consumer genealogy database for reasons having nothing to do with the Bear Brook case. The Y-chromosome match connected the Bear Brook DNA through the son to Rasmussen. The California conviction, which had already placed Rasmussen's DNA in a separate criminal database under his alias Curtis Kimball, allowed for final confirmation. The identification told investigators who the killer had been. It did not tell them who the women and girls in the barrels had been.
Those identifications, for the 3 members of the Honeychurch family, came in 2019. Through further genealogical work, again led by Ray Venter and by the New Hampshire State Police, Marlies, Marie, and Sarah were named. Their headstones were placed, 41 years after their deaths, in a cemetery in Southern California. Marlies' sister, who had been the last relative to see them alive in 1978, was present at the burial. The 4th girl, the approximately 3-year-old in the second barrel, did not match the Honeychurch family. Her DNA did not match anyone in the immediate genealogical databases. Her remains did not correspond to any reported missing child from the relevant era. She was, for 5 more years after the Honeychurch identifications, simply called, in the New Hampshire files, the unknown child. In 2024, the New Hampshire State Police entered into a partnership with the DNA Doe Project, a national non-profit that specializes in genealogical identification of unidentified remains. Over the following year, a team of volunteers at the DNA Doe Project built a family tree from the child's genetic material that ultimately included 25,000 individuals. In June of 2025, the tree produced a match. The child in the second drum was Ray Rasmussen. She had been born in Orange County, California, in 1976. She was the biological daughter of Terry Rasmussen himself and of a woman named Denise Bowden, known also as Pepper Reed, who had been Rasmussen's girlfriend at the time of the child's birth. Pepper Reed has not been seen since the late 1970s. New Hampshire investigators believe, though they have not formally confirmed, that she was also killed by Rasmussen, that the disappearance of the mother and the presence of the child in his barrel were part of the same pattern that consumed the rest of his victims. Her body has never been found.
On September 7, 2025, the New Hampshire Attorney General's office held a press conference to announce the identification of Ray Rasmussen. The press release described the genealogical work in detail. It thanked the DNA Doe Project. It asked anyone with information about Pepper Reed or about any other potential victim of Terry Rasmussen to contact the state police. Sergeant Matthew Elphick, the New Hampshire State Police investigator who had led the Bear Brook case in its final years, said something in an interview with New Hampshire Public Radio that summarized what investigators across 4 states had come to understand about Rasmussen's life. "I am afraid," he said, "that he kept doing this. He was one of the few serial offenders who killed people he knew. The people he knew were the people who trusted him, and he chose them because they had nobody else." What is known at the point where this record ends is this: 4 bodies were placed at different times over the late 1970s into 2 steel drums near Bear Brook State Park. The drums were found 19 and 15 years apart in the same clearing, 90 meters from each other. The killer was identified 32 years after the first drum was found. 3 of the 4 victims were identified 33 years after the first drum was found. The 4th victim, his own biological child, was identified 40 years after the first drum was found. The mother of the 4th victim remains missing. Another former companion of Rasmussen's, a woman named Denise Boughton, who disappeared in 1981, also remains missing. New Hampshire considers both of them likely victims. Terry Rasmussen died in prison of natural causes in December of 2010, 8 years after his California murder conviction. He was cremated. His remains were placed in an unclaimed remains facility. They are not, in any formal sense, the property of any of the families whose relatives he buried in the woods. The 2 barrels are no longer in the forest.
They have been moved to a forensic facility in Concord, New Hampshire. They will, if they hold additional evidence of additional victims whose names have not yet surfaced, be examined again. Bear Brook State Park remains a public recreation area. The clearing in which the barrels were found is not marked. The state has, by request of the families involved, chosen not to draw attention to the specific location. A small stone at a cemetery in Southern California marks the burial of Marlies Honeychurch and her daughters Marie and Sarah. A second small stone, placed in 2026, marks the burial of Rhea Rasmussen. Pepper Reed has, as of this writing, no stone.